Well, Mathias Cormann, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
So, it's attracted a bit of attention in Australia that you are supporting a carbon price now in your new role. Can you explain where your stance is at on this?
Well, what I'm supporting, what the OECD is supporting, is ambitious and effective action on climate change. And I've had a consistent view always that in order to be genuinely effective and publicly supported over the long run, you need a globally coordinated approach. I mean, climate change can only be resolved through global action, this is what I've argued for in Australia. That is what I'm arguing for now in the job that I've got. I'm in a position where I can hopefully try and help facilitate it, because in the end, what we need is for measures in individual jurisdictions to help solve the global problem, not to just shift it into other parts of the world. And that is, where I'm saying we ought to have, in the same way as we've had an inclusive framework approach for tax, bringing all of the G20 countries and 136 countries around the world onto the same page on tax, which was very difficult. We need a similar approach to the pricing of carbon emissions, not just explicit carbon emissions, because that is what a lot of the commentariat sort of exclusively focuses on, but also all of the other ways to help reduce emissions, what we would describe as implicit prices on carbon. And Australia is pursuing...
All right, can you explain to me what that is? What's an implicit price on carbon? Give me an example of how it works.
Well, in the end, different parts of the world use different policy levers. There's a whole range of different policy levers that you can use in order to help reduce emissions. In theory, an explicit price on carbon will be the most effective, but there are...
So a carbon tax?
Well, no, in theory, an equally consistently applied price on carbon globally could be the most efficient. But the problem is, if you don't have a consistently applied arrangement, you'll end up with trade distortions, carbon leakage, and the shifting of emissions into other parts of the world. So you need to find ways to resolve that. And incidentally, that is why the European Union is talking now about this carbon border adjustment mechanism, because they are thinking about how can we lift ambition and effort without harming the competitiveness of our businesses and without just sending emissions to other parts of the world where they're going to be higher. A carbon price only makes sense if it doesn't create counterproductive distortions, if it doesn't send emissions into other parts of the world where for the same level of output they would be higher. That was my argument in Australia from 2007 onwards, from my first speech in 2007 to when I chaired the Senate Fuel and Energy Committee in 2009, where I actually released a report which talked about the need for carbon, the approach to climate change to be environmentally effective and economically responsible, and all the way since, and still today.
But didn't you call Julia Gillard's carbon tax a hoax in terms of reducing emissions?
Well, look, I'm not
saying this is the same point.
I'm not going to go into political rhetoric now. I'm not in the domestic debate, but let me just make this point. The point that was my argument, the fundamental point then, and is still the fundamental point now, that whatever we do in an individual jurisdiction needs to help solve the global problem. It can't be something that just shifts the problem into other parts of the world, where for the same level of economic output, emissions are going to be higher, which would mean an increase in global emissions.
Of course that makes total sense. But
that was my argument then.
But it's not that simple, is it? Don't some countries have to lead out, or it just doesn't happen? That's what the Europeans are about with carbon tariffs, aren't they?
Well, in the end, the Europeans, quite rightly, are trying to solve the problem on how you can lift ambition and effort in a way that doesn't harm the competitiveness of your businesses and that doesn't lead to carbon leakage, doesn't just shift emissions into other parts of the world. Ideally, though, you would be able to achieve that same outcome through a multilaterally agreed approach. And that is what I argued back in 2009, and that is what I'm still arguing now, and that is what I believe through the OECD.
All right, well, what about China and India? Two of the biggest emitters. Well, should they introduce a carbon price? They argue we're developing nations. This is one of the major problems.
But you're making my point for me. So what I'm saying is...
but how do you get there? How does it happen?
But this is why China, India, Russia, the US, all of the European countries, Australia, Saudi Arabia are all part of the international tax reform deal that the OECD helped shepherd through the G20 process.
So you think
more than 90% of GDP around the world has signed on to this international tax reform. Well, I believe we have to have a go at it. I believe that that's what we've got to do. We've got to try and bring countries around the world through the G20, through an OECD inclusive framework type process around the table to make sure that we do have a more coherent, better aligned approach to help achieve emissions reductions in individual jurisdictions in a way that actually helps reduce emissions for the world and that actually helps to get us to global net zero by 2050. Now, will it be easy? No, it won't be. But we haven't really made that much progress on that front looking back. So, I mean, I think we're going to have to give that a go. And I mean, look, and this is something that can be pursued and should be pursued.
All right. Well, Scott Morrison says technology, not taxes, which when you're in his government, you probably would have said the same. So technology doesn't sound enough.
Well, look, I mean, technology is a very important part of the equation. Of course it is. I mean, everybody will tell you that technology innovation is going to be hugely important.
But he says you can do it just through technology. That's what he says.
And let's put a process in place that monitors and scrutinizes and regularly assesses and reports on progress that's achieved, that compares the effectiveness, cost, effort and impact of the different policy methodologies, which that's what the OECD does. Assess what's being done, assess how much you've got to pay to get what outcome, report on it, and then inform the world on how they can achieve better outcomes at the lowest possible cost. And then over time, I believe that information will actually help improve performance everywhere. Let countries learn from each other's successes and from each other's, I guess, failures. And this is core business for us.
Are you happy he's committed to net zero, Scott Morrison?
I think it's a huge achievement, and I admire the political leadership that he's displayed to be able to get Australia into that position. And it's great that Australia is joining the global community, the overwhelming part of the global community that is committed to achieving global net zero by 2050.
Should he go for a bigger medium-term target?
I'm not going to give Scott Morrison advice, public advice.
What's your private advice?
I've had a very good conversation with him yesterday, and I'll continue my conversations with the Australian government as I do with every other government across the OECD and beyond.